The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a surgical saw cutting through bone. Natalie Hayes clocked in at 6:41 a.m., her badge disappearing beneath the collar of her Portland Sacred Heart scrubs before anyone could read the name tag. 8 years. 2,920 days of being invisible in these corridors, and she perfected the art of it, the way she moved between patients without leaving an impression, the way doctors looked through her instead of at her, the way her hands could hold someone's life together and no one would remember her face by the end of the shift. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hit first, always. Then the sound, that constant mechanical breathing of ventilators, the rhythmic beep of monitors, the squeak of sneakers on polished tile. The ER was already moving. Thursday morning meant full beds, half-alert residents, and attending physicians who hadn't slept since Tuesday. Natalie grabbed her assignment sheet from the nurse's station and scanned it without expression. Trauma Bay 3, post-op recovery, ICU consult. Standard rotation. Her hands moved to check her pockets out of habit. The dog tag was there. Single piece of metal on a broken chain, cold against her ribs where she kept it tucked beneath her scrubs. Not regulation. Not anything anyone should see. She'd worn it for 20 years, longer than she'd worn the title that came with it, longer than she'd been allowed to acknowledge either one existed. Major. The word felt like a language she'd stopped speaking. Hayes, we've got an admission incoming, called Jenkins from triage, not looking up from his screen. Trauma service is slammed. Bed 3 is prepped for spinal concerns. Copy, Natalie said. Her voice came out flat, calibrated. She'd learned to speak this way, professionally deferential, the kind of tone that made people forget you'd spoken at all. Her eyes were already moving toward the intake board. Male patient, early 30s, complications from shrapnel lodged near the. She stopped reading. The paramedic radio crackled. Incoming from home care transfer, Green Beret, separated from active duty, multiple shrapnel sites from 2008 IED, complications presenting acute onset. Patient is Marcus Webb. Alert for irritability and PTSD triggers. He's in a wheelchair, transferring to bed is going to take assistance. The tile floor felt suddenly uneven beneath her feet. Natalie's right hand rose to her collar, fingers finding the dog tag there instinctively. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. This was the training that mattered, the kind they didn't teach in nursing school. The kind that came from being buried alive under rubble in Ramadi with a child's hand gripping your sleeve while you whispered that everything would be okay. 20 years. She'd spent 2 decades wondering if he was alive. The ambulance doors burst open like a sound violation. Natalie moved into position without deciding to move, her body remembering protocols older than her nursing license. 2 paramedics guided the chair down the ramp. The patient was broad-shouldered, lean the way only soldiers got lean, the kind that came from carrying gear instead of body fat. His hair was military short. His eyes were the color of burnt copper, and they swept the room with the tactical awareness of someone trained to notice exits and threats. His eyes landed on her for 1.2 seconds. Then moved on. She should move on too. That was the protocol. Keep breathing. Stay invisible. Finish the shift. 14 more years until retirement and she could disappear completely into whatever life was left after you'd already died on paper. Marcus Webb was being transferred to the bed now. His movements were fluid despite the wheelchair, his hands gripping the transfer handles with the kind of strength that came from upper body training. There was a scar along his left forearm, surgical, precise. Not from shrapnel. From something smaller. From something that had been carefully stitched together in the dark with field hands trembling so badly the needle nearly slipped. Natalie's hands were trembling now. Not visibly. She'd learned better than that. The trembling was all internal, contained the way rage was contained, the way grief was contained, the way 20 years of questions were contained in a single breath. Natalie, chart work, call Jenkins, and she was moving, sliding the electronic tablet up, scrolling to intake notes, medical history, previous admissions, surgical history, and there was the scar pattern. 3 field sutures in a configuration that no surgeon in any hospital would ever replicate. Personal signature work. Emergency work. Work done by someone who knew what they were doing and knew they'd never do it in a hospital setting again. She'd placed those sutures in the dark. The child had been crying. She'd told him her name, Natalie, she'd said, though that wasn't her real name anymore. She'd told him she was going to keep him alive. She'd made a promise she'd been forbidden to keep. Natalie. A voice cut through the static in her head. Dr. Ashford was standing 3 feet away, his tie pressed, his smile thin as a scalpel. He was the kind of handsome that lived in expensive restaurants and weekend houses. The kind of handsome that made other doctors trust him. You seem very interested in the new admission. She didn't look up from the chart. Her jaw tightened slightly, a half-millimeter shift that Ashford might not have noticed. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Ashford was noticing everything. Just reviewing his file, Natalie said. Each word was placed carefully, like surgical instruments being arranged on a sterile field. Spinal considerations. I want to be thorough with positioning. Of course you do. Ashford stepped closer, reading over her shoulder. His cologne smelled expensive and chemical. His voice dropped to something less performative, something that only she could hear. You seem to know quite a bit about this patient already. It wasn't a question. Natalie felt the weight of his gaze like pressure. She was still looking at the chart. The scar pattern was still there. The note said the injury was from 2004, Ramadi operation, unspecified details, classified incident. The medical file was incomplete. Someone had redacted sections. Entire pages were missing from a 20-year-old incident that official records said never happened. I've never met him before, Natalie said. I'm just reading the chart like I read all charts. Right. Ashford's voice had shifted into something colder, something that operated beneath the surface of professional courtesy. Well, don't read too deeply. Some charts are better left alone. Some patients have histories that are better left buried. He moved away, but not before she saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew something. Or he suspected something. Or he was testing to see if she would break. Natalie finished her shift the way she finished every shift, competently, invisibly, with hands that moved through medical procedures with the kind of precision that made people trust her without trusting her. She placed a new 4 on Marcus Webb around 9:15 a.m. Their eyes didn't meet. She found the vein on the first attempt, the needle going in smooth and sure. His forearm was a roadmap of scars, some surgical, some not. Some from shrapnel. Some from training. Some, she suspected, from learning how to survive a childhood that ended in rubble. By the time her shift ended at 3 p.m., Dr. Ashford had already made 3 phone calls. She knew this because the charge nurse mentioned that Ashford was pulling some strings upstairs about staffing. She knew this because Jenkins suddenly looked uncomfortable when she passed the nurse's station. She knew this because when you'd spent 20 years learning to read rooms and recognize threats, you got very good at noticing when the air pressure changed. Natalie clocked out at 3:06 p.m. and walked through the parking lot toward her car, her badge hidden under her collar, her dog tag hidden under her scrubs, and her real name hidden behind a surname that wasn't hers. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. In another universe, in another life, she would have felt it as relief. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. In another universe, in another life, she would have felt it as relief. The overhead intercom crackled at 3:41 p.m. Not a code. Not an emergency. Something worse. Nurse Nightingale to administration. Nurse Nightingale to administration. The floor went quiet. 3 nurses stopped charting. A resident pretended to read a monitor. The nickname, the one they'd been using for 2 weeks, whispered in break rooms and scribbled on assignment sheets, now broadcast across every speaker in the building. Nightingale. Because she worked nights. Because she was invisible. Because someone had decided mockery was easier than respect. Natalie set down her pen. She did not look up. She did not let her breathing change. One measured breath. That was all. She stood, straightened her scrubs, and walked toward the elevator with the kind of calm that came from having survived things these people would never understand. Her hands were steady. Her spine was straight. The tears would come later, if they came at all. The elevator doors slid open. Dr. Ashford stood inside, alone, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. The doors closed behind her. "You're becoming a problem," he said. His voice was smooth as oil on water. "I've noticed your attention to certain patients. Your questions. Your presence where you shouldn't be." Natalie did not step back. The supply closet would be the next stop. She could smell the bleach before they even arrived, the sharp chemical bite that covered everything else. Ashford was close enough that she could see the paws on his neck, the careful grooming, the surgeon's hands that had never held anything they couldn't put down. "Mr. Webb's case is sensitive," he continued, stepping closer. His cologne was expensive. It made the small space suffocating. "There are things in his file that don't concern bedside nurses. Things that stay between me and hospital administration." He was not asking. He was explaining the terms. "You keep your curiosity to yourself," Ashford said, "and your job stays secure. You start asking questions about his records, his background, his admission, and I make one phone call. One conversation with HR about protocol violations, boundary issues, unprofessional conduct. You'll be terminated before your shift ends." It was not a threat disguised as conversation. It was naked institutional power. He could do it. They both knew he could do it. One phone call and her 9 years at Sacred Heart meant nothing. One call and the careful life she'd built, the invisible existence, the quiet redemption, all of it gone. Natalie took a measured breath. Her eyes met his, unflinching. The tears did not come. "Not yet. Not here." "I understand," she said. He stepped back. He'd expected something else, compliance wrapped in fear, an apology, the small diminishment of her posture. But her voice had not wavered. Her eyes had not dropped. There was something in the way she stood, even in that confined space, that made him feel smaller. The elevator descended. The parking lot was waiting. The sun was lower now, amber light slanting across the asphalt. Natalie walked to her car with the rest of the day's shift, her badge still clipped to her scrubs, her stethoscope looped around her neck. She could feel the attention before she heard it, the way conversations paused, the way people's phones came out, the way the energy shifted. "Hayes." Ashford's voice carried across the parking lot with deliberate projection. He stood near the administrative entrance, arms crossed, his tone casual but his intention precise. "Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to graveyard rotation. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Thursday. I'll be reviewing your clinical performance during the transition period." The floor staff were loading into their cars. The physician assistants were checking their messages. The respiratory therapist was fumbling with her keys. Everyone could hear. Everyone knew what this meant. Nights. The unwanted shift. The isolation. The slow removal from visibility, from being part of the day team, from mattering. It was not a demotion in title. It was a demotion in everything else. Natalie stood beside her 2009 Civic. She did not move toward the car. She did not move toward him. She simply stood there, breathing, her hands at her sides. One measured breath. Another. The setting sun made the tears harder to hide, but she did not look away from Ashford's face. One single tear escaped. She let it fall. Then, with her other hand, she wiped it without breaking eye contact. Without shame. Without the small flinch he'd been waiting for. "You must be protecting something worth more than your conscience, doctor." Her voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that moved through a room like a shock wave. The parking lot seemed to recognize it. The wind died. A phone stopped ringing. For 3 seconds, there was only the sound of her words settling into the air and the certainty that she was looking at a man who understood, finally, that he could not break what had already been broken and rebuilt 1,000 times. Ashford's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Just enough. Natalie got into her car. She did not slam the door. She did not spin out of her space with anger. She simply sat behind the wheel, gripped it once with both hands, and then started the engine. In the rearview mirror, Ashford was already walking back inside, his phone already in his hand, making the calls he'd promised to make. The drive home took 17 minutes. The rain started at mile 9, light at first, then harder, until the windshield wipers could barely keep pace. She drove through Portland streets, past the hospitals and shops that would mean nothing to her soon, past the life she'd been pretending to live. At 5:22 p.m., she was standing at the cemetery in the Jade District. The grave was simple. No elaborate monument. Just a name and dates, James Patrick Hayes. 1976 to 2005, beloved. She stood in the rain. Her scrubs were soaked. Her badge hung heavy around her neck. I tried, she whispered. I tried to stay hidden like they ordered. But I failed you. I failed all of it. The rain hammered down like applause for a performance no one was supposed to witness. Behind her, a car pulled into the cemetery. Then another. At 5:38 p.m., her phone buzzed. An email from hospital administration. Termination papers. At 5:51 p.m., she was still standing in the rain. And that's when everything changed. The rain had stopped by 6:13 p.m., but the parking lot still glistened under the sodium lights. Natalie stood in her car with the engine running, hand steady on the wheel, when her phone buzzed. A text from the surgical scheduler, Marcus Webb, routine shrapnel extraction, operating room 3, tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. start. She closed her eyes. Routine. Nothing about this was routine. What she didn't know was that Dr. Ashford had already made 3 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief surgical resident, a gifted surgeon with 847 hours of solo operating time, which meant she was still technically supervised. Ashford pulled her from her assigned cases and reassigned her to lead Marcus's procedure. The second call went to the hospital's shift coordinator. Senior surgical nurses, the ones with 20-plus years who could spot a botched intubation from across the room, were suddenly needed in the ICU that morning. All of them. The third call was to his contact at the state licensing board, the one who owed him a favor from an incident with a prescribing error that had mysteriously disappeared from records. Just keeping doors open, Ashford had said. Just in case. By 7:04 a.m., Marcus was under general anesthesia, his chest prepped and draped, and the surgical team, Dr. Chen and 2 second-year residents, neither of whom had assisted on a trauma extraction from shrapnel lodged against cardiac fascia, was ready to begin. The medication pump read out his doses, fentanyl at 2.5 micrograms per kilogram, which should have been 1.8. Propofol at 12 milligrams per kilogram, which should have been 8. Muscle relaxant at twice the standard maintenance dose. Not enough to kill him outright. Just enough to make him profoundly dependent on the ventilator, sluggish, unable to compensate if something went wrong. Ashford observed from the gallery, arms crossed, watching the monitors with the expression of a man who had already won. The first 20 minutes proceeded without incident. Dr. Chen's hands were steady. She made the left anterolateral thoracotomy incision with precision, splitting the ribs with a Finocchietta retractor, gaining access to the mediastinum. The shrapnel was visible, a jagged fragment the size of a thumbnail, embedded in the visceral pericardium, exactly where the pre-op imaging had indicated. Easy extraction. Routine. And then the monitor showed the first sign. Heart rate climbing. 94, 106. 118. His light, one of the residents said, eyes on the anesthesia panel. No, Ashford called down from the gallery. Continue. The medications had been prepared by Ashford himself that morning. No one questioned it. He was the attending physicians prepared critical medications all the time. The shrapnel extraction took 4 minutes. Dr. Chen lifted it clear of the pericardium with careful tweezers, placed it in a specimen cup, and began closing the pericardium with 4.0 silk sutures. Textbook technique. The monitors showed heart rate at 142 now, still climbing. BP 161/94 and rising. He needs more sedation, Chen said. He's fine, Ashford replied. Close him. The pericardium was closed. The ribs were approximated with sternal wires. The chest wall was being sutured when Marcus's oxygen saturation began to drop. 96, 92. 88. Sats falling, the anesthesiologist said, fumbling with the ventilator settings. I'm increasing FiO2 to 100%. 78, 71. 64. The heart monitor showed the rhythm fracturing, QRS complexes widening, becoming irregular. Ventricular ectopy. The preload was crashing. The medications Ashford had administered, those excessive doses, had tanked his cardiac output, had made his heart a fist that couldn't pump, and now with the chest wall open, with blood pooling in the mediastinum, with inadequate monitoring of the field itself, Marcus was exsanguinating into his own thorax. He's coding, Chen whispered, her voice rising. Get the charge pad. Get epinephrine drawn up. But the chest was still open. You couldn't defibrillate through an open thoracotomy. You had to manually compress the heart itself, perform an open cardiac massage, and the 2 residents were frozen, staring at the field, at the bleeding, at the monitors showing a flat line. Do something, one of them said to the other. Neither moved. Heart rate 0. BP not detectable. O2 sat 48. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze in the silence. And then footsteps. Fast. Someone was running down the hallway outside the surgical suite. The doors burst open and Natalie was there, still in her shift scrubs from post-op recovery, having been called down by the first alarm, and she took in the scene in one breath. Open chest. Flat line. Frozen team. Ashford standing in the gallery, watching. She didn't ask for permission. She shoved past the paralyzed residents and ripped open the supply cabinet with one hand, her other reaching for Marcus's personal belongings stacked on the shelf. The regulation said never to open them in the OR, but she wasn't thinking about regulations. She grabbed his backpack and tore it open. MRE rations. Field rations from his last training exercise. One medical pouch. Ripped it open. Combat gauze. Emergency bandages rated for hemorrhage control. Packaging that had been designed by field medics in Kandahar, by trauma surgeons in forward operating bases, by people who understood that sometimes you had to improvise with what you had. Her hands moved on their own. Get me the chest seal kit, she said. Not a request. A command. The surgical nurse fumbled for it. Natalie didn't wait. She was opening the MRE packaging with her teeth, fashioning the plastic into a crude occlusive dressing, taping it with surgical tape in a 3-sided seal that would allow air to escape but prevent it from being sucked back in, the same technique she had learned in 2004 in Ramadi when a 7-year-old boy with shrapnel wounds and a collapsed lung had needed something, anything, to survive the helicopter ride to the field hospital. Manual compression, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something else entirely. I want compressions on the cardiac mass. Now. A resident moved to comply. Not like that. Here. She positioned his hands on the ventricles herself, showing him the angle, the pressure, the rhythm. You're trying to pump blood through a dying heart. Think of it as a fist. Rhythmic. Purposeful. The chest seal was in place. The emergency dressing held. Air pressure in the thorax stabilized. Epi, she said. 1 milligram for push. She's not, Chen started. 1 milligram. Now. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in combat. Someone who had stood in a hospital in Ramadi and directed multiple surgical teams simultaneously while shells landed outside. The residents didn't question it. The epinephrine went in. The heart monitor showed the first beat. A single electrical pulse, weak, barely visible. Then another. A rhythm emerging from the flat line like a ghost learning to breathe again. Compressions continue, Natalie said, her hands moving to monitor the 4-axis, checking blood return. Come on, Marcus. You survived Kandahar. You can survive this. Heart rate climbing. 45, 62, 78. She had her fingers on the pulse in his neck now, feeling for the carotid thrust. There. Faint but there. O2 sat climbing, the anesthesiologist said, voice shaking. 58, 63, 68. Aggressive fluid resuscitation, Natalie said. 2 units of O negative. Crash transfusion. And someone get me a definition of what Dr. Ashford was thinking when he ordered those medication doses. The room went absolutely still. The first person to move was Dr. Ashford. He had stepped back from the gallery railing, his face showing something that might have been fear or might have been calculation. He was already reaching for his phone. She could see it from across the room. He was already making calls. O2 sat 75. 82, 88. 92, stable. Heart rate 96, strong, regular. Blood pressure climbing back to viable ranges. Closure, Natalie said, stepping back, her voice returning to its normal register even though everyone in the room had just heard something else emerge from that body. Get a cardiothoracic surgeon for the final inspection. And someone paged the medical director. Dr. Ashford and I need to discuss medication dosing protocols. It wasn't a request. It was a command written in a voice that had held its authority through 3 deployments, through the weight of lives that depended on her decisions being correct. The next words out of Ashford's mouth weren't spoken in the gallery. They came 40 minutes later, during a phone call to the hospital administrator, followed by termination paperwork drafted with clinical precision. Insubordination. Practicing outside her scope. Unauthorized administration of medication. The documentation was already prepared. All it needed was a signature. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitor shrieked. Then stopped. Flatlined to sinus rhythm in 7 seconds, the moment Ashford realized he'd lost control of the narrative. He stood at the edge of the trauma bay, watching the numbers climb back to normal, watching Natalie step away from the bed with her hand still moving, muscle memory finding the next task before her conscious mind caught up. The senior resident stared at her like she'd just walked out of a myth. She peeled off her gloves and didn't make eye contact with anyone. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. But Ashford needed to move. Fast. He was on his phone before Marcus's oxygen saturation hit 94%. 3 calls in succession. First to the hospital board, a man named Sterling who owed him a favor from a consulting contract involving questions that were never supposed to be asked. Then to the State Nursing Commission. Then to someone else entirely, the kind of call that required walking to the stairwell and closing the door. Natalie heard none of this. She was charting Marcus's vitals with the precision of someone documenting a field save, using terminology that didn't appear in civilian nursing protocols. O2 sat, blood pressure, pupil response, Glasgow coma score. Each notation another small confession of the life she wasn't supposed to be living. By 1847 hours, the termination paperwork was on her manager's desk. Insubordination. Practicing outside her scope of practice. Violation of hospital protocol. The kind of charges that would follow her everywhere, that would make sure no other institution hired her, that would tether her permanently to the half-life she'd already been living. Ashford had been thorough. He always was. Her manager, Linda, found her in the locker room at shift's end. Linda was 62 and had worked at Sacred Heart for 34 years and had never once been forced to fire someone she respected. She held the papers like they were contaminated. Natalie read them standing up, didn't sit, didn't ask for an explanation. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The composure that had gotten her through Ramadi and Kandahar and every classified location the Pentagon pretended didn't exist held firm. It wasn't a request, Natalie said quietly. It was a command. Linda's face crumpled. I don't understand what happened in there. I've never seen anything like it. Neither has anyone else. She cleared her locker methodically. Scrub cap she'd owned for 8 years. A photo of her late husband, Marcus Webb Sr., though not that Marcus, in his dress uniform, 75th Ranger Regiment insignia on his chest. A pair of compression socks. Nothing personal. Nothing that said who she was. And in the back corner, behind everything, a single dog tag on a broken chain. The metal was tarnished nearly black. She held it for 3 seconds, then slipped it into her jacket pocket. The rain started as she walked to her car. Not the gentle Portland drizzle that locals complained about, real rain, the kind that hammered the asphalt like applause for a performance she hadn't wanted to give. She drove to Riverview Cemetery without deciding to. Her body just knew the way. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Professional. Military. Because soldiers don't fall apart at intersections, they drive the route and execute the plan. The grave was near the back, away from the main pathways, where the ground was still soft from winter. Marcus Sr. rested under a granite stone that said his name and 2 dates and nothing about what he'd actually been. Nothing about the Delta Force selection course he'd passed in 1998. Nothing about the 7 confirmed kills in Jalabad. Nothing about the mission on November 14, 2004, in the Jolin district that had left 2 operators KIA and had been buried so deep that even Congress didn't know the real casualty count. She'd been there. She'd held his hand while blood drained faster than 4 lines could replace it. She'd whispered his call sign, Reaper, and told him she loved him and told him to hold on, and then she'd told him goodbye because she was military enough to know the difference between hope and denial. She stood in the rain for 8 minutes. No umbrella. No jacket over her scrubs. The water ran down her spine in rivulets that felt like punishment and proof that she was still alive and still failing at the only job that mattered. The dog tag in her pocket felt heavier than its 3 grams of weight. Cold metal against her ribs. Her heartbeat against it. Proof. Evidence. A crime scene labeled evidence. I tried to stay hidden like they ordered, she said to the stone. Her voice was barely audible above the rain. But I failed you. I failed all of it. The words hung in the rain. Official narrative, Major Natalie Hayes, Delta Support Operations, died in a training accident on March 3, 2005. Equipment malfunction. Classified briefing materials prevented any public memorial. Her name was on a wall in Langley that didn't officially exist. Her decorations were filed in a basement in the Pentagon that required clearances to enter. Her son Dylan had been told his mother died in a car accident, had been given a closed casket funeral, had been raised by her sister and told never to speak about her again. And Natalie Hayes, the woman, not the designation, had walked into Sacred Heart Hospital 8 years ago with a falsified resume and a nursing degree purchased through channels that left no paper trail, because the intelligence community had told her, disappear. Become invisible. If you surface, we will make you wish you hadn't. She'd followed orders. She'd been excellent at it. She'd healed people and asked no questions and worn her powerlessness like armor. But a 6-year-old boy had needed saving today, and apparently some orders don't stick when they're tested against the actual weight of a human life in your hands. The rain intensified. Wind came next, the kind that bent the cemetery trees. She looked at the dog tag again, Marcus SRS, not hers, because she couldn't carry her own. 1 name. 1 rank. 1 serial number. 1 piece of military equipment that proved a man had existed and served and died in a location the government would never officially acknowledge. She held it out over the grave like she might drop it, might let the earth take it back, might step away from all of it and become the ghost she'd agreed to be. And then she heard it. Distant. 2 kilometers out. But unmistakable. The sound of rotors cutting air in a pattern her nervous system would recognize across any noise floor. Helicopter. Military bird. Coming fast. She closed her fist around the dog tag. Her phone buzzed. Text message from a number she didn't recognize. 10 words, your son is safe. Stand by. Help is en route. Lightning split the sky. She stood at her husband's grave in the rain wearing scrubs stained with another man's blood, holding a metal tag from a ghost, and waited for the one thing she'd never expected, rescue. The rotor sound grew louder. 3 kilometers. 2. The rain hammered harder like the sky itself was breaking open. She didn't move. She didn't call out. She just waited, her military training converting the moment into data, wind direction, arrival vector, threat assessment. No threats. Just homecoming. The first Black Hawk appeared through the rain and cloud cover, then a second, then a third, cutting through Portland airspace like a knife through silk. They didn't land, they hovered, maybe 40 meters from the cemetery fence, close enough that the rotor wash shook the cemetery trees and sent leaves spiraling. A rope ladder descended from the belly of the first aircraft. Boots on ground. 4 of them. Military posture. Professional. They moved toward her through the rain like soldiers moving through contact, deliberate and precise. The man in front was broad-shouldered and gray-bearded and wore the kind of uniform that didn't belong to any active duty branch anymore. He saluted her. Fist to chest. Then he spoke, Major Hayes. We've been looking for you. Security escorted her past the front desk at 6:33 a.m., her termination papers still warm in the manila envelope clutched against her scrubs. Natalie didn't resist. She didn't argue. She simply walked, each step deliberate, hand steady, the way someone moves when they've already accepted the worst outcome before the words were spoken. The Portland rain hammered the revolving doors like it was trying to warn her something was coming. That was when Dylan appeared in the lobby, her 17-year-old son, pale-faced and furious, holding a lockbox made of scratched steel that she'd kept buried in the basement for 18 years and explicitly forbidden him to ever open. His voice cracked like new ice breaking. Mom, they need to see these, you're a major. She didn't respond. The words hadn't fully landed yet. But they were already moving toward her. An elderly nurse with hands that trembled as they reached for the lockbox. The woman's name was Patricia. She'd worked at Sacred Heart for 34 years. Patricia lifted the first medal with the reverence someone gives to holy objects, and her voice began to break before she even read the citation aloud. Extraordinary Heroism Under Fire. Ramadi, 2004. 19 civilians rescued under sustained enemy contact. This is a Bronze Star. The words hung in the lobby like they'd been waiting 2 decades to be spoken. Another nurse stepped forward, Marcus's day nurse, Rivera. She opened the next citation, hands trembling worse than Patricia's. Silver Star. 3 confirmed surgical saves during active combat operation. Enemy combatant neutralized after engagement at trauma site. She paused, the weight of it settling. Second Silver Star. Mountain Warfare, Kandahar Province, 2006. 37 personnel medically stabilized and extracted under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Each medal had its own moment. Each one a year of her life that the hospital, that Portland, that the world never knew existed. The lobby was filling now. Day shift nurses arriving, morning custodian stopping mid-sweep. Nobody moved toward the exits. Marcus wheeled himself through the glass doors, still in his hospital gown despite everything, and he stood, actually stood, pressing his weight down through his palms braced against the wheelchair arms. His legs shook. His face went white with effort. But he stood. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition and something deeper, something that had been waiting for him to say for 20 years. That major saved my life in Ramadi when I was 6 years old. I joined the Green Berets to find her. And she just saved me again. He held the position for 3 more seconds, then collapsed back into the chair, but his eyes never left hers. The man who stepped forward next wore civilian clothes, grey suit, no badge visible yet, but everything about him moved like federal authority. He was lean, shoulders like a coat hanger, voice precise and almost clinical as he spoke. FBI. I'm Special Agent Christopher Reeves. He held up his credentials without flourish. Dr. Martin Ashford is under investigation for accepting $375,000 in payments from a shell corporation connected to a weapons trafficking operation. The operation in question is connected to the classified 2004 mission in Ramadi, and Dr. Ashford was retained as a consultant to ensure certain operational details remained buried. He paused, letting that settle. It appears he's now attempting to destroy evidence related to this investigation. Patricia made a sound like something breaking inside her. The security footage had been archived at 2:14 a.m., Reeves explained, by the hospital's IT director, a 38-year-old Marine veteran named Thomas Halloway who'd served with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines before his medical discharge. Halloway had noticed unusual server activity at 1:38 a.m. He'd watched the feeds and seen Ashford in the server room, sweating, hands moving across keyboards with the desperation of someone trying to erase the unerasable. Halloway had quietly mirrored every drive, every video file, every medication administration record. He'd made copies and delivered them to federal investigators at 5:22 a.m., before his morning coffee, because he recognized the look of a man trying to bury the truth. That same expression he'd seen in interrogation rooms in Kandahar, except this time it was happening in Portland, Oregon, in a hospital that was supposed to heal people. The hospital security guard, a kid named Morrison, maybe 23, was receiving his termination papers at that exact moment in Ashford's office. Ashford had tried to get him to delete the footage, had offered him $50,000, had threatened his family's access to VA benefits, had done everything except tell the truth. Morrison, whose father had died in Walter Reed 4 years ago, had refused and reported the attempted bribery to the FBI hotline before breakfast. Ashford's office door was already being opened by federal agents with their badges like small shields of authority, and he was standing up from his desk with his face draining the color of old paper, stammering about misunderstandings and files and procedures that nobody was listening to anymore. His mouth moved. Nobody heard anything but the sound of handcuffs clicking and boots on linoleum and his own voice breaking into something that wasn't language anymore. 6 months later, someone spotted him at a folding table outside a strip mall urgent care in Tucson, Arizona, in a sun-bleached polo shirt printed with an insurance company logo. The name tag read Steve. His hands fidgeted with brochures about supplemental coverage while people walked past, and when a woman approached the table, he flinched, the kind of flinch someone makes when they used to have power and suddenly don't. He never made eye contact. He never mentioned his medical degree. When someone called him doctor by accident, something in his shoulders collapsed inward. But Natalie wasn't in Tucson. She was standing in Sacred Heart's boardroom on a Tuesday morning, wearing dress blues for the first time in 20 years, the fabric hanging on her frame like she was becoming a new person by putting them on. The medals hung over her left breast in ascending order of honor. Her son stood to her right, hand on her shoulder. Marcus sat to her left, still in his wheelchair, but his uniform bore the insignia of a decorated green beret, and his eyes held something that looked like peace. The hospital board members sat in leather chairs looking at a woman they'd called just a nurse 1 week ago, and now they couldn't quite focus on her face because the uniform kept getting in the way of what they'd been blind to. The chief medical officer was offering her a position. Director of Trauma Services. 6 figures. A team. Her name on the department letterhead. She listened to every word, then asked where the night shift inventory was stocked, because she wanted to know if her supplies were where she'd reorganized them after the last audit. Why? They asked. Because I'm going to keep working nights, she said. I'm staying in scrubs. Patience over politics. She paused, letting her eyes move across each face. I've spent 20 years being invisible. I think I'll spend the next 20 being useful. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. For 2 decades she'd held herself down, made herself smaller, accepted every condescension and public humiliation and parking lot demotion because she'd been ordered to disappear. She'd been a major in the United States Army. She'd held the hand of a 6-year-old boy in the rubble of Ramadi while his family lay silent around them, and she'd decided that night that if she survived, she'd spend her life pulling people out of broken places. The Pentagon had ordered her to vanish. The classified operation had been buried. The official report said Major Natalie Hayes died in a training accident on March 18, 2005. But she hadn't died. She'd only been sleeping. Now the fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart didn't hum like a soundtrack to invisibility anymore. They hummed like applause. That evening, after the board meeting, after the press release was prepared and the federal charges against Ashford were unsealed, after Marcus was discharged and Dylan had stopped shaking, there was a moment on the hospital steps. The Portland rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet concrete and something like beginning. A barista from the coffee shop across the street, the one where Natalie had gotten the same black coffee for 8 years without anyone knowing her name, was waiting near the entrance. Her name was Sarah. She was 26, with dark hair and careful eyes, and she'd always made Natalie's coffee with something like recognition in her movements, even when Natalie herself had been anonymous. Sarah held out a cup with a phone number written on the side in permanent marker. Neither of them spoke. Natalie took the cup. Their fingers nearly touched. Sarah smiled and turned back toward the street, and Natalie stood there holding the coffee, and for the first time in 20 years, the weight of everything she'd been carrying felt a little bit lighter. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, if you've ever had to stay silent about who you really were, tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Before we go on, thank you for watching. Please hit like, it really helps. Subscribe if you're new. And leave a comment letting us know you're here. We love hearing from you.